There's nothing to tell Alex. I have not lost. I have not lost his points. His points are fine. Fucking bullshit. Fucking hate this game. This is torture. This is just torture.
Hey everyone, welcome to another rapid fire review, this time for Lords of the Fallen. It's a dark fantasy Souls-like game where we play as a lamp bearer, a character who, using the lamp, can exist in the world of the living and venture into the world of the dead. The demon god Adir, who was previously banished, has been gaining strength and threatens to re-emerge to take over the land of Mournstead. The setting and story of the game are typical dark fantasy through and through. Dark forests, snowy mountainsides, burning cities, and of course a poisoned swamp are the backdrop for our adventure. The areas for the most part are visually distinct enough to keep things exciting. It is dark, figuratively and literally, but once all the baddies are dead, if you take some time to really look around, you can appreciate the temples or ruins or castles. The lantern and two-world system for exploration are pretty well implemented. There are lots of opportunities for secrets or alternative routes built into each area. Exploration in general is great here. Shortcuts, optional mini-bosses, loot, and upgrade materials are all over each map. If you find yourself in an area that appears to be a dead end and you haven't found something cool, you should perhaps pull out the lantern and look again. Hexworks did a pretty good job with visual and audio cues to let you know where important lantern spots are, so you won't need to have it out the entire time. The Umbral Realm itself has unique enemies and a dread build-up mechanic that if you're in it for too long, bigger nasties spawn and beat you up. The music is thematic and perfectly fits the dark fantasy theme. There's some really good stuff in here. The voice acting is a bit more hit or miss. There's some outstanding performances, and not in a great way. It's like the voice actors were trying to use a voice kind of outside of the range, and it comes off as very forced. The layouts for each section are organic enough, say for a swamp that I'm sure they want you to get lost in because it's a poison swamp, and I'm sure there's a law requiring it. The flow of the game is fairly straightforward in the beginning. The sections lead into each other, and you'll know where you are and where you're heading. Later on, though, it's far less focused, and you may get lost. Okay, now for the important bit. I totally understand that I normally have a massive bias towards these games. I love the challenge that they present, and the dark worlds and themes, and the combat puzzles that I can come back to and approach in wildly different ways. And I wanted to love this game, I really did, but I felt like the game just wouldn't let me. Combat and movement is paramount in these games, and I have some pretty major issues with the decisions they made for the game. Movement inside of combat can be very floaty. You feel like you're fighting on ice skates, sliding all over the goddamn place for some reason. My starting weapon for my first playthrough moved me about 12 feet per normal attack, and the enemies take 3 to 4 hits per attack, so I felt like I was doing strafing runs. Targeting in Lords of Fallen is perhaps the worst in any modern Souls-like, maybe the worst in any modern game. There's no way that paid and competent playtesters ran through this game and tested the targeting and said, yup, this is acceptable. It's truly horrible. It's bad in combat, it's bad for traversal. There are useless egg things or suicidal non-combatants all over the place that your character will focus on instead of what you want to. You'll even spin all the way around to target something useless, while some big nasty monster man has his way with you. Targeting ranged enemies is another problem made worse by the fact that ranged enemies in this game are powerful. Super powerful, in fact. They're like little fantasy howitzers that will delete your ass from places well beyond your range to select them. Lords of the Fallen definitely wants you to incorporate ranged combat into your builds, which I do like. Bows, throwables, or spells are very easy to include to help thin big groups or take out pesky mages. And these options are powerful. Some of them are actually completely broken. But in order to attack these enemies at range, you have to be able to target them. And sometimes that doesn't even matter because they are completely impervious to damage because they have a stupid little blue fairy that you have to suck off at melee range in order to damage them. Now, there are a ton of different weapons in the game, which is great, but unfortunately there isn't much difference between them. Within the same class, they all have the same moveset, and if you dual wield, you just kind of sideswipe no matter what you're using. The boss weapons are the exception, and some of them are incredible. I just wonder why over 100 other weapons were included if there's really not going to be much difference between them. No weapon skills, nothing. The accessory system with rings and pendants provided a ton of room for customization. There's some really powerful stuff here. The rune system feels far less well implemented. I like the idea of them, and some work well enough, but others didn't seem to work at all, or just had such little effect that there wasn't much use for socketing them. The lamp also felt a little underbaked when it came to combat. I just wish it was more impactful. Most of the time I was just annoyed I had to pull it out to get rid of a blue worm thing. There's a parry system in the game, but it too didn't feel great. The enemies continue to attack through your parries, giving you gray health that returns when you deal damage back. I don't have a problem with the gray health part of the system, as much as I do the enemies just not reacting at all in the slightest to being parried. There's a blue sparkle, a noise that doesn't really seem to fit, and then eventually you'll stagger them, and you can give them a sad Grievous strike. I just wish it felt like it had more weight and impact. For individual enemies, at the start of the game I thought we were getting region-specific bad guys. Swamp people and, creatures in the swamp, random soldier types where you would expect soldier types, but from the midpoint on I had seen all of the enemy types. The bosses range quite a bit in quality. Unfortunately, I had a few with bugged AI. They got stuck in their own arena or just spun in circles instead of fighting. Some bosses were good, and some presented almost no challenge. And for me, adding a 0 to the total boss hit points in New Game Plus doesn't make the boss fights better, it just makes them take longer, and that's not the same thing. The only truly memorable boss is the final encounter, and only because it's so bad. The final fight is a monologuing giant idiot, and he has a few dozen naked cavemen standing about, and they'll start throwing homing fireballs at you. There's no challenge to it, it takes too long, and when it was over, I couldn't believe that was the end of the game. My big issue with Lord of the Fallen seems to be a difference in the devs' design philosophy and what I personally enjoy in these games. So much of the difficulty I had with the game came from things outside of the combat or bosses. It's dealing with UI, the movement system, the targeting system, or just getting repeatedly gotcha'd isn't what I look for in these games. Do you see a long bridge over the Umbral Abyss after a long section? There's no beefy knight guarding it, setting up a high-stakes fight. Instead, there's a tiny, exploding little gremlin guy hidden on the ceiling outside of view, and when you approach, it falls and explodes, instantly knocking you to your death. Do you need to get through that fence in the Umbral Realm? Well, you're dumb, because there's an instant ambush by a Dementor, a Splooge Fairy, exploding gremlins, and about 50 zombies. Now, these sections are standard and welcome, typically in these Souls-like games. There's always collapsing bridges that lure you in with loot or a guy waiting around the corner to come get you. But instead of a light sprinkling of this kind of stuff to spice things up, it felt like they haphazardly dumped it en masse, with no finesse to it. Just surprise after surprise, which for me removed the impact of the surprise and became the game's entire identity. I want you to beat me with combat, not with bullshit. And maybe this is the kind of stuff that other people want, but I want my deaths to make me sit forward in my chair and try harder, or to learn the fight. I shouldn't be rolling my eyes when it happens. There's other quality of life things like random pieces of trash masquerading as useful loot automatically get added to your quick bar. So if you aren't paying attention, instead of healing or restoring your mana, you'll apply some balm that makes you take 0.05% less damage from food poisoning or whatever it does, and then you're dead. Or Vestige Seed save points right around the corner from permanent ones, so you waste a very limited resource that costs 2,500 souls. In New Game Plus, they remove all but one permanent vestige, so the one seed bed is all you get, which is in line with the game's apparent philosophy of inconvenience is the same as difficulty. New Game Plus and Plus Plus when I played was just a mess. Exploring places you missed, farming upgrade materials, doing NPC quests, or getting new endings or character unlocks was just tedious. I felt like they were purposely wasting my time. There's no +1 or +2 versions of items, you don't scale all that much, and the hit points they give bosses in New Game Plus is hilarious. If you're like me, you'll spend the entire time rolling away from mass clumps of dudes you're tired of fighting. And I only ended up playing through New Game Plus and beyond to test other weapons and playstyles for the review, not because I wanted to. I know I just spent quite a bit of time complaining, but the bulk of the gameplay does work. It's not totally broken or awful, and many people are even loving it. But for me, something felt off the entire time. It's just missing the satisfaction I want from these games. There isn't a boss I want to go back and fight, or an enemy or group of enemies that I want to get back to. There's no combat system I want to practice. There aren't even weapons I want to go back and try, or spells that I want to make work. So in the end, this is a game where I love the theme, I love the atmosphere, and the music. The combat and overall gameplay are fine, but ultimately weren't satisfying. I felt like it just needed more time and more testing. Now the good news is Hexworks has been constantly patching and making changes to the game and listening to feedback. They've already made some quality of life changes and are walking back some of the weird decisions with New Game Plus, and they seem very interested in changing the game for the better. So if you want to check out Lords of the Fallen, I would definitely suggest waiting. Here we review games in the state we play them though, and with the amount of sad or broken bosses and gotchas over gameplay, I have to say that this is a game that I sort of enjoyed, but was very disappointing. So I'm giving Lords of the Fallen a 4 out of 10 in its release state, which at the Angry Joe Show is slightly below average game score. It's not a failing score, it's just not up to par. There's definitely fun to be had, there's plenty of content for its price, but in the state I played it in, it just isn't up there with the other successful recent Souls-likes. If you played Lords of the Fallen, let me know how much I needed to get good in the comments, or if maybe you were disappointed too. Thanks for sticking with me to the end, and I shall see you on the next Angry Joe Show.
And that was a bad idea too. I hate this game. This is the worst.